I will never forget the moment my billionaire grandfather ruined Thanksgiving dinner with $10. Not 10,000. Not even 100. Just 10. He stood up at the long dining table, calmly handed each of us a small envelope, and sat back down without a word. When I opened mine and saw the single crisp bill inside, laughter broke out around the room. My cousins smirked. My aunts whispered. Someone muttered, "That's it?" I felt my face burn with embarrassment, not because of the money, but because of what everyone assumed it meant. They called him stingy, cold, cruel. I stayed quiet, clutching that $10 bill in my hand, watching my grandfather's eyes move slowly from face to face as if he were memorizing every reaction. Months later, I stood in a lawyer's office, holding a file thick enough to change everything I thought I knew about him. And I realized something terrifying. That $10 wasn't a joke, it was a test, and my family had already failed it. Thanksgiving at my grandfather's house was never about gratitude. It was about hierarchy. The Miller mansion stood on a hill at the edge of town, its tall glass windows reflecting the gray autumn sky like a mirror that refused to show warmth. Every year, cars lined the circular driveway, luxury sedans, polished SUVs, vehicles that cost more than my annual salary. People stepped out dressed in designer coats, laughing loudly, already performing the roles they had rehearsed for decades. I arrived quietly, carrying a pie I had baked myself. No one noticed. Inside, the air smelled of roasted turkey and expensive cologne. Crystal chandeliers hung above the dining room, glowing softly, while a table long enough for a board meeting stretched across the room. Each place setting was perfectly aligned, napkins folded with military precision. This house was built to impress strangers, not to hold family. "Emma, you're late," my Aunt Linda said as soon as she saw me, glancing at her watch. "Put that over there." She didn't ask how I was, she never did. "Yes, Aunt Linda," I replied, forcing a smile as I set the pie on the sideboard already crowded with desserts no one had made themselves. I took my seat near the far end of the table, where the younger generation always sat. Being the youngest grandchild meant I was expected to listen, not contribute, observe, not question. Across from me, my cousin Jake leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. "I swear," he said loudly, "if taxes go up again, I might actually have to cut back." "On what?" His sister Emily laughed. "Private flights?" Everyone chuckled. I didn't. At the head of the table sat my grandfather, Richard Miller. He didn't join the conversation. He rarely did. He wore a simple dark sweater instead of a suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his posture straight despite his age. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a retired accountant, quiet, contained, and impossible to read. People liked to call him stingy. Behind his back, he could buy the entire town, my Uncle David once joked, and still complain about the price of coffee. Tonight was no different. As dinner was served, conversations drifted toward money, as they always did. "Richard, did you hear about the new resort project?" Uncle David asked, too casually. "Incredible returns." My grandfather nodded once. "I heard." "That's it?" David pressed, smiling tightly. "That's enough," my grandfather replied. Silence followed. Not awkward, just final. I watched my family exchange looks, subtle but unmistakable. They were all here for the same reason. Not for turkey, not for tradition. They were waiting for approval, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for generosity. I focused on my plate, pushing mashed potatoes around, trying to ignore the weight in the room. I had learned long ago that attention in this family came at a cost. "Emma," my cousin Emily said suddenly, glancing at me. "You're awfully quiet." I shrugged. "Just listening." "Well," she smirked, "you should listen closely. You might learn how money works." Laughter rippled around the table. My face warmed, but I said nothing. I glanced at my grandfather. For a brief moment, our eyes met. There was no judgment in his gaze, no amusement, just something thoughtful, almost curious. Dinner ended with polite clapping for the chef, who was not present. Chairs scraped against the floor as people leaned back, satisfied but restless. Servants began clearing plates, moving silently like shadows. Then the room went still. My grandfather placed his napkin on the table and stood. "I have something for all of you," he said calmly. Every conversation stopped. Phones were lowered. Smiles sharpened. Backs straightened. I felt my chest tighten, a strange unease settling in my stomach. Whatever was about to happen, I knew one thing for certain. This Thanksgiving was about to be remembered for all the wrong reasons. My grandfather didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile either. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his sweater and took out a small stack of white envelopes, each one identical. The sight alone made my Aunt Linda straighten in her chair. "Well," she said lightly, folding her hands. "That sounds interesting." My grandfather began walking slowly along the length of the table, handing an envelope to each person. He didn't explain what was inside. He didn't make a speech. He just placed one envelope in front of every plate, nodded once, and moved on. When one landed in front of me, I hesitated before touching it. The paper felt thin, too thin. "Go on," my cousin Jake said with a grin. "Open it, maybe this year's the year." Laughter bubbled up, nervous and expectant. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the contents. A single bill, $10. For a moment, my brain refused to process it. Then someone laughed, out loud. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake said, holding his bill up between two fingers. $10? From a billionaire? My Aunt Linda covered her mouth, but not fast enough to hide her smirk. "Richard," she said carefully, "this is symbolic, right?" My Uncle David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Is this some kind of joke?" Around the table, whispers spread like static. $10. He's lost it. This is humiliating. I looked down at the bill in my hand. It wasn't old. It wasn't wrinkled. It was crisp, intentional. My grandfather returned to his seat at the head of the table and folded his hands again. "That's your gift," he said calmly. Silence fell heavy and uncomfortable. "That's all?" Emily asked, her voice sharp. "You give strangers more than this." My grandfather met her gaze. "Do I?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly not expecting a response. Jake shook his head, laughing. Wow, this is next level." Someone else muttered. "Typical." I felt my face burning. Not because of the money, but because of the way everyone was looking around at each other. At him, at the envelopes, as if they'd all just been insulted together, as if they were entitled to more. I didn't laugh. I didn't say anything at all. I just sat there, staring at the $10 bill resting on my palm, wondering why my chest felt so tight. Across the table, my grandfather's eyes moved slowly from face to face. He didn't look angry. He looked observant, as if he were studying us. "Thank you," I said quietly, before I could stop myself. The room went still. My aunt turned toward me. "Emma, don't be ridiculous." "I meant it," I said, my voice barely steady. "Thank you, Grandpa." My grandfather's gaze settled on me for a fraction of a second longer than the rest. Then he nodded. Just once. Later that night, as coats were pulled on and goodbyes exchanged, I heard my family whispering behind my back. "She's trying to look good. Maybe she thinks it'll get her more later." $10. Can you believe it? I slipped the bill into my pocket and stepped out into the cold evening air. Something told me this wasn't the end of it. It was the beginning. After Thanksgiving, the $10 bill followed me everywhere. Not physically. Mentally. It echoed in conversations. In jokes that weren't really jokes. In the way my family spoke about my grandfather as if he were no longer in the room even when he was. At the next family gathering, my Aunt Linda laughed a little too loudly. "Careful. Don't ask Richard for help," she said, waving her hand. "He might go broke." People smiled, nodded, played along. My grandfather didn't react. He rarely did. But I noticed things others didn't. Like how he stopped attending dinners early. How he lingered by windows, looking out instead of engaging. How conversations fell flat when he entered a room, then resumed as soon as he left. The label had settled. Stingy, cold, miser. And everyone wore it like a badge of moral superiority. One afternoon, I visited him alone. That alone was unusual. The mansion felt different without my family's voices filling it. Quieter, colder. The staff moved respectfully but kept their distance, as if they understood something the rest of us didn't. I found my grandfather in the library. Rows of books lined the walls, old, well-worn, nothing flashy. He sat by the window, reading without glasses, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. "You didn't call ahead," he said without looking up. "I wasn't sure you'd want company," I replied. He closed the book slowly and studied me. "That depends on the company," I swallowed. "I just wanted to check on you." He nodded once. "Sit." I took the chair across from him, suddenly aware of how quiet the room was. No ticking clock, no music, just us. "They're still talking," I said finally. "I know. Doesn't it bother you?" He leaned back, folding his hands over his chest. "People reveal more about themselves when they think they're judging someone else." "That sounds lonely," I said softly. For a moment something flickered across his face, then it was gone. "Loneliness," he said evenly, "is not the same as being alone." I hesitated. "Then why, the $10? He looked at me carefully. "That bothered you?" "No," I said quickly, then corrected myself. "It confused me." A faint smile touched his lips, not warm, not cruel, thoughtful. "Confusion is useful," he said. "It forces people to confront their assumptions." I frowned. "About money?" "About character." The words stayed with me long after I left. In the weeks that followed, my family's attitude shifted not toward him, but toward each other. They complained more openly. Compared notes, calculated. "If he's not going to help us," Jake said once, "we should stop pretending." "Honestly," Emily added, "he's selfish. That's all there is to it." I wanted to argue, but I didn't know how, because I still didn't understand. Then, one evening, my grandfather called me. "Come by tomorrow," he said. "I need help organizing some papers." I arrived early. The documents were already laid out neatly, stacked folders, labeled but not explained. "These aren't finances," I said after a while. "No," he replied. "They're histories." I flipped through one folder. Hospital correspondence. Another school tuition records. Another legal aid letters. None of them had names attached. "These aren't yours," I said slowly. He met my gaze. "They're not meant to be." My heart began to race. "Why are you showing me this?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, "Emma, do you know why most people fail tests they don't realize they're taking?" I shook my head. "Because they think the reward comes first," he said, "and the meaning comes later." He stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Go home," he said gently. "We'll talk again." I left with more questions than answers, and a growing sense of unease. Because something was happening beneath the surface of our family, something none of us wanted to acknowledge. And for the first time, I suspected that the $10 wasn't the story, it was the warning. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was halfway through a cup of coffee, staring out my apartment window, when my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Almost. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Miss Emma Miller?" a man asked, his voice calm, professional. "Yes. My name is Thomas Reynolds. I represent your grandfather, Richard Miller." My stomach tightened. "I'm calling to inform you that your grandfather has requested your presence this afternoon," he continued. "It's important. Is something wrong?" I asked, already knowing the answer before he spoke. There was a brief pause. Just long enough. "His health has declined," Reynolds said carefully. "He would like to see you while he's still able to speak for himself." The room felt suddenly too small. "I'll be there," I said. The mansion felt different that afternoon. Quieter than usual. Not empty but restrained, as if everyone inside was holding their breath. The staff moved more slowly, their voices lower. I was led not to the library this time, but upstairs, to the west wing. My grandfather's bedroom door was slightly open. He was sitting upright in bed, thinner than I remembered, a blanket pulled neatly over his legs. He looked older, more fragile, but his eyes, sharp, focused, were the same. "You came quickly," he said. "Of course," I replied, taking the chair beside his bed. "How are you feeling?" He shrugged. "I've felt worse. I've felt better." There was a knock at the door. Thomas Reynolds stepped inside, carrying a slim briefcase. "We won't take long," my grandfather said. "Sit, Thomas." Reynolds opened his case and laid out several documents on the bedside table. "These are legal protections," he explained. "Medical certifications, trust amendments, witness confirmations." My heart began to pound. Why are you showing me this? I asked. My grandfather looked at me steadily. Because I need someone who listens. Reynolds cleared his throat. Your grandfather has made certain arrangements, some of them unconventional. I swallowed. Arrangements for what? For what happens after, my grandfather said simply. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Emma, he continued, you are the only person in this family who thanked me without asking what came next. My chest tightened. You didn't laugh, he said. You didn't whisper. You didn't calculate. Reynolds nodded. That matters more than you realize. A wave of fear washed over me. Are you saying? I'm saying, my grandfather interrupted gently, that people reveal themselves when they believe they're being disappointed. I will ni will tan she and that it's see. I shook my head slowly. They'll never understand you. He smiled faintly. They were never meant to. I reached for his hand, surprised at how cold it felt. What do you want me to do? I asked. He squeezed my fingers weakly. Nothing yet. Reynolds stood. We'll continue later. As I left the room, I heard my grandfather's voice one last time. Emma. I turned. Remember, he said softly, generosity isn't measured by what you give. It's measured by what you expect in return. That night, I lay awake, replaying every word, because I knew deep down that whatever he was preparing would not bring peace. It would bring conflict. And I was standing directly in its path. My grandfather passed away 3 weeks later, quietly. No dramatic final words, no last-minute confessions. Just a short phone call from Thomas Reynolds, his voice steady and professional, informing me that Richard Miller had died in his sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time after that call ended, staring at the wall as if it might explain something to me. It didn't. The funeral was held on a cold gray morning, the kind where the sky feels heavy, pressing down on your shoulders. The chapel was elegant but strangely empty. There were no long lines of mourners, no emotional speeches, just polite nods, hushed conversations, and eyes that kept drifting toward one another, not toward the casket. I stood in the back, dressed in black, my hands clasped so tightly they ached. Across the aisle, my family sat together, not united, strategic. My Aunt Linda leaned toward Uncle David, whispering behind her hand. My cousins checked their watches. Someone sighed loudly, impatient. No one cried. I wanted to scream. After the service, as people stepped outside into the cold air, I overheard fragments of conversation. Did he change the will? He wouldn't dare cut us out. I heard he got worse toward the end, as if he were a burden. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following afternoon. Thomas Reynolds's office overlooked the city, all steel and glass, impressive, controlled, neutral. The kind of place where emotions didn't belong. Everyone arrived early, too early. They filled the conference room, sitting stiffly around the long table, eyes sharp with expectation. When I entered, conversations stopped. Why is she here? My cousin Jake muttered. Emily didn't bother lowering her voice. Probably curiosity. She was always close to him. I took the last chair at the far end. Thomas Reynolds entered precisely at 2 o'clock. Thank you for coming, he said, taking his seat. I'll begin. He read calmly at first. Standard distributions, legal language, corporate assets. People relaxed. Then he paused. Before we proceed further, he said, adjusting his glasses, there is a special provision. The room leaned forward as one. Richard Miller established a private trust 5 years ago, Reynolds continued. The trustee named is Emma Miller. Every head turned toward me. What? Linda snapped. That can't be right, David said sharply. Jake laughed. This is a mistake. Reynolds didn't flinch. It is not. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The trust does not provide personal cash gifts to family members, Reynolds continued evenly. Instead, it grants full authority over certain documented operations. Operations? Emily scoffed. What operations? Reynolds slid a thick folder across the table, toward me. Emma, he said, your grandfather instructed that you be the one to reveal this. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. Inside were records. Years of them. Donation confirmations, medical grants, educational funding, legal aid payments, anonymous, consistent, massive. The room erupted. This is ridiculous. He was stingy. This has to be fake. I stood up slowly, my voice shaking but steady. He wasn't stingy, I said. He was careful. They stared at me like I had lost my mind. He gave away hundreds of millions of dollars, I continued, quietly, to people who couldn't give him anything in return. That's impossible, Linda said, her voice rising. He gave us $10. Yes, I said softly. And you judged him for it. Jake slammed his hand on the table. You manipulated him. Reynolds stood. That accusation is false and legally dangerous. The room fell silent. All documentation is certified, he continued. Medical evaluations confirm full mental capacity. Witnesses are on record. Emily's face drained of color. This trust, Reynolds concluded, is legally protected, and Emma's role is final. No one spoke. I felt sick, exposed, overwhelmed, but beneath it all, there was something else. Understanding. The $10. The silence. The test. And now? The truth. As the meeting ended, my family avoided my eyes. Some with anger, some with fear, some with shame. I walked out of the office alone. And I knew, without question, this wasn't the end of the conflict. It was only the beginning. The backlash didn't wait. It started before I even made it home. My phone buzzed non-stop, missed calls, messages, voicemails piling up faster than I could read them. Some were from family members, others were from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored all of them. By the next morning, the story had spread. Not the truth. A version of it. Granddaughter takes control of billionaire's assets. Family dispute erupts after will reading. Was Richard Miller manipulated? I stared at the headlines on my laptop, my hands trembling. Each article twisted the facts just enough to make doubt feel reasonable. At noon, my Aunt Linda showed up at my apartment. She didn't knock. She stood outside the door, pressing the buzzer repeatedly until I answered. Emma, she said sharply, stepping inside without permission. What do you think you're doing? I closed the door behind her, my heart racing. This wasn't my decision. Oh, don't play innocent, she snapped. You were always the quiet one, the observant one. We should have known. Knew what? I asked. That I wouldn't laugh at him? Her jaw tightened. That you'd take advantage. I shook my head. Everything was legal. You heard the lawyer. We'll challenge it, she said coldly. This isn't over. And she was right. 2 days later, Thomas Reynolds called. They're preparing a formal legal challenge, he said. Claims of undue influence, exploitation. My chest tightened. Can they do that? They can try, he replied calmly. But the trust is solid. Medical certifications, witnesses, documentation spanning decades. I sank into a chair, exhaustion washing over me. I never wanted this. I know, he said. That's precisely why your grandfather trusted you. The pressure came from every direction. Family members stopped pretending to care about my feelings. Conversations turned transactional overnight. You could at least help us out, my cousin Jake said over the phone. After everything we've done for you. What exactly have you done? I asked quietly. He hung up. Old friends reached out with awkward congratulations and thinly veiled requests. Strangers sent messages accusing me of greed. Some implied I had isolated my grandfather. Others suggested I'd hidden information. I barely slept. At night, I replayed his voice in my head. Generosity isn't measured by what you give. It's measured by what you expect in return. One evening, my parents called. They hadn't defended me. They hadn't spoken up at the will reading. Emma, my mother said carefully, you need to be smart about this. I am, I replied. No, my father cut in. Smart would be sharing, keeping peace. At what cost? I asked. Silence. Money changes people, my mother said finally. Yes, I said softly. It shows who they already were. They didn't call again after that. The legal letters arrived soon after, formal, intimidating, written to unsettle, but Thomas Reynolds countered every move with calm precision. They're relying on pressure, he told me, not facts. Still, the weight was unbearable. One night, sitting alone in my apartment, surrounded by documents and unanswered messages, I broke down, not because I was afraid of losing, but because I finally understood what my grandfather had lived with for decades: the isolation, the misunderstanding, The cost of refusing to perform generosity for applause. I wiped my tears and straightened my back. Because if I was going to carry his legacy, I had to survive the storm first. The turning point didn't come from a courtroom. It came from a spreadsheet. I had been sitting at my kitchen table for hours, surrounded by documents my grandfather had left behind: bank records, trust summaries, correspondence marked confidential. At first, I was only trying to understand enough to defend myself legally, but then I started seeing patterns. Transfers that repeated every year, amounts too consistent to be random, accounts that never led back to him directly, hospitals, scholarship funds, housing assistance programs, legal aid foundations, all anonymous. I called Thomas Reynolds immediately. "These donations?" I said, my voice unsteady. "How long have they been happening?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Over 20 years?" he replied. "Your grandfather was meticulous." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. "Why didn't anyone know?" "Because he didn't want them to," Thomas said. "He believed gratitude changes intention." That night, I barely slept. Not from fear this time, but from clarity. The $10. The silence. The way he watched people instead of reacting to them. It all made sense. My grandfather didn't give small gifts because he was stingy. He gave them because he was filtering, testing, watching who valued him only when money flowed freely and who didn't. By morning, I had made my decision. If my family and the public were going to judge him, then they deserved the truth. But not as a spectacle, as a reckoning. 2 weeks later, the city announced the opening of a new community health center funded by an anonymous donor. The local news praised the generosity, speculated wildly about the identity. I asked to speak at the ceremony. Thomas hesitated. "Once you do this, there's no going back." "I know," I said. "But it's time." The crowd was larger than I expected. Families, officials, cameras. I stood at the podium, hands trembling, heart pounding louder than the applause. "My grandfather believed good deeds didn't need applause," I began. "And for most of his life, he lived by that." The murmurs grew quieter. "For more than 2 decades, I continued, he quietly funded hospitals, schools, housing programs, and legal aid without ever attaching his name." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "He was labeled stingy," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "But the truth is, he gave away more than most people ever will." I held up the documents. "These aren't rumors. They're records." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy, honest. I scanned the crowd and saw familiar faces. My aunt, my cousin, my parents. They didn't look angry. They looked stunned. "I'm not here to defend myself," I said. "I'm here to correct the story. Because he never did." When I stepped down, people didn't rush me. They stood still, processing. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something loosen in my chest. The storm hadn't ended, but the truth was finally louder than the noise. The days after the announcement felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just quieter. The headlines changed tone. The accusations softened into corrections. The questions shifted from, "What did she take?" to, "Why didn't we see it?" People who had avoided my eyes for months suddenly nodded when they passed me. Some even stopped to say thank you, not to me, but to my grandfather. I accepted those words carefully. Because gratitude, when it comes too late, carries weight. My family reached out slowly. Not all at once. Not dramatically. My parents came first. They sat across from me at my kitchen table, hands folded, eyes lowered. "We were wrong," my mother said quietly. "We let our expectations speak louder than our values." I nodded. "I know." My father cleared his throat. "We don't want money to stand between us anymore." I met his gaze. "Then it can't be the reason we talk." They agreed. Not easily, but honestly. As for the rest of the family, some apologized, some didn't. Some stayed silent. I learned to let that be enough. The foundation my grandfather built continues its work, still quietly, still carefully. I oversee it, not as an owner, but as a steward. Every decision passes through lawyers, auditors, safeguards. Because generosity deserves protection too. I kept the $10 bill. Not in a drawer. Not hidden. It sits framed on my desk, a reminder of the moment everything began. Of the test I didn't know I was taking. and of the lesson my grandfather never put into words. That character shows up when there's nothing to gain. That real kindness doesn't ask to be believed. And that sometimes, the smallest gift tells you the biggest truth. Thanksgiving came again the following year. This time, I cooked. I invited only those who came without expectation. The table was smaller. The room was warmer. And for the first time, gratitude felt real. Not because of what was given, but because of what no longer had to be proven.